like to call Dr. Amanda Evans.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you please introduce yourself?
I'm Amanda Evans.
And how are you employed?
Well, I'm currently unemployed. I retired from Florida Gulf Coast University in May after 20 years.
How were you employed prior to your retirement?
I was a graduate professor in clinical social work for 20 years.
Okay. And can you tell us about your educational background?
Right. I have a bachelor's of sociology from Florida Southern College in Lakeland, a master's of clinical social work from University of South Florida in Tampa, and a doctorate in leadership from University of Central Florida. So basically a straight line across the state, so I don't go cold, yeah.
Okay. And what is your practical experience with that education?
Prior to joining the university, I was a trauma social worker for 20 years. At first at what was Fort Myers Community Hospital, so this is dating me, and then at Lee, what's now Lee Health, but Lee Memorial's Trauma Center. And I worked in the intensive care unit and the trauma center.
Are you licensed in Florida?
I am. I'm
How are you
licensed under
licensed?
Chapter 491, which is covers clinical social work, mental health counseling, and marriage and family therapy.
Let's see. What has been your academic experiences? How long did you teach? What did you teach?
I was hired in January of 2000 I was actually hired in 1999 as a visiting professor, and then January of 2000. And I taught clinical courses in the diagnostics. I taught trauma and recovery, loss and bereavement, and interpersonal violence.
As an academic, what has been your field of research?
It's always been in the field of trauma, and even before I joined the university, I was an educator for physicians in the area of domestic violence and how it applied to their practice.
Have you ever published in that field?
I have. I've published in human trafficking. I've also published, I co-authored a book that was published in London and New York and distributed across the world called Trauma Informed Care, How Neuroscience Influences Practice, and it's in its second printing now.
Have you done some consulting work over the years as well?
I have done primarily consulting work in the area of trauma. There aren't that many trauma specialists in the state, actually. So I've done education and training for postgraduate professionals, physicians, educators, because there just aren't that many of us, and the neuroscience information has advanced so quickly over the last 2 decades that keeping on top of it is really something that only an academic can do, because we have access to all of those journals where the people in practice don't have access to that. So that's been kind of my thing for 20 years.
Have you also been involved with training law enforcement professionals?
Yes, because I was the researcher for the task force for when the Lee County Sheriff's Department had the task force money from human trafficking that was disseminated, and so I was the researcher for them for 2 years, and then they actually wrote another grant with Department of whatever it is now, Homeland Security now, but whatever it was at the time, for me to develop a trauma-informed forensic interview model, because they felt like, this was Lee County Sheriff's Department, they felt like they needed a different approach to interviewing trauma survivors, especially human trafficking survivors. So I wrote a new model that we worked with, actually the Children's Advocacy Center, because they had forensic interviewers already, and Homeland Security and I worked together in Washington with the U.S. Attorney's Office to develop that.
What has been your involvement in this case regarding Mr. Jimmy Rogers?
I was contacted by you after his court date to look at the developmental trauma issues, and that's really my field, is developmental trauma, the impact of trauma on the developing brain. So that's really what I was contacted to look at, and sent a lot of documents. So I've read the PSI, I've read the rest reports, I read the mother's hospitalization history from his birth. I have not met the Mr. Rogers, but I did speak to his brother and to two of his aunts just to see whether or not the information gathered had any first-hand experience or whether or not it was hearsay, but I was able to talk to the family members about what I gathered.
Okay, who did you talk to?
I spoke to Mary Bodine, who is one of the aunts on the father's side, so his father's sister, and I spoke to Shirley Rogers Parks, who is an RN, who is also a sister of Mr. Rogers' father.
And did you also review social service records?
I did. I reviewed social service records. There were several reports of first neglect and then possibly abuse by DCF. The first one at the age of 13, I believe.
Well, let me stop you there.
yeah.
And just circle back around
Actually,
a little bit.
age 9. Yeah.
Okay. You indicated you have not met Mr. Rogers.
No, I've not. No.
That's Mr. Rogers there in the red. So apparently you did not interview him at all, right?
I did not.
Okay. How does that affect your ability to come in here and render any opinions?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I did is this is like a case study. So like I'd be presented a case study and all of the supporting evidence from arrest records, birth records, any intervention that would occur. The way I look at trauma is adverse childhood experiences on the developing brain and the ages that those occur. That's important because how the brain develops. And looking at where the adverse experiences occurred and then what possible outcome would be, looking at education, how someone did in the educational settings. I didn't get as many educational records as I would have liked, but that's the way it goes. Look at intervention with law enforcement and when somebody intervenes with law enforcement or interfaces with law enforcement, because when you have early childhood trauma like this, people tend to go a couple ways. One is to get very aggressive and start acting out and be constantly in trouble and basically hitting someone before they hit you kind of thing. Or people tend to withdraw. So there are two kind of ways that people respond to this in order to deal with the world that they've been given. And so I look at those records too to develop kind of a story around whoever is presented here to get a big picture. That's why it was important for me to get as many records as I could to review and to look at both the report, the PSI, and also from the law enforcement reports, past arrest records, and then talk to family members and their impression of what they saw.
Did some of the reports or records and documents contain what would be referred to as self-reports from Mr. Rogers?
The PSI definitely was, yeah. There was a lot of self-report. So when I self-report, and that's important because it's someone's perception of their experience, but it's also good to get supporting information as well. So someone's perception versus what an official says or a law enforcement agency says.
Is it unusual to receive that sort of document in your line of work?
I don't always get it. I often just get self-report, and so I'm a diagnostician, so that's my world, is to diagnose and see who's in front of me, not to make anybody nervous. I don't diagnose people.
So would it be fair to say that, had you interviewed Mr. Rogers, the self-report, that would be the information that you would have gained or tried to gain? Or
I would want to know the impact. I'm a mental health professional, so that's where my eyes go. So I would want to know the impact and how someone copes with the kinds of things that he experienced from birth. How did he learn to cope through life? How did he maneuver through life? What adaptive things he's done? And we all have these things that we do to counteract whatever life has given us. This particular chronology, there's a lot of adaptation that would need to take place in order for someone to put one foot in front of the other. So,
well, let's talk about his life history. Did you have a chance to both review medical records concerning his birth and talk to family members.
Yeah, I did. I read the medical records from his birth. As his brother said earlier, that it appeared to be a natural birth until everything was fine until she got into the hospital. And then the fetus developed what they called bradycardia, which is the heart's beating too fast. So they did an emergency C-section. He was diagnosed with hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which basically means he was without oxygen. The umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, and he was rushed to the university hospital. Now, those records were not available to me. So the baby's records from University Hospital. So I had to speak to the aunt, who's the nurse. She said he was in a university hospital for about 2 weeks. And on respiratory monitoring because he was having difficulty breathing still. So we've had a lack of oxygen to the brain, and that's an important thing that I would look at in this process. And then 3 weeks at home on a monitoring system until his lungs developed and he was able to breathe more naturally. And that's
Was
her
his
memory
life
of
in
that.
danger at that time?
Yeah, and actually the mother, and this is in the mother's records, the mother was going to have her tubes tied. Tubal ligation at the time she was going to go in to deliver this to Mr. Rogers, but because he was in such poor health at the time of birth, the physician, and this is in the physician's notes, spoke to her about maybe delaying that just in case he didn't survive
Okay.
to live, and so that was delayed, and she didn't
So
have it.
did
at the time.
these difficulties during his birth and the resultant lack of oxygen, how did that affect Jimmy?
Well-
Objection. Lack of foundation.
So when you have a lack of oxygen at the fetal stage, at the developing brain stage, lack of oxygen can we have to have oxygen to the brain to develop the other subsystems of the brain. So the most common thing you see are learning disabilities. Another thing that you see is emotion regulation, of the ability to reason through emotion. As we all age, a toddler learns to handle their emotions in a way that's healthy. If they don't develop that, then they develop other ways of coping with it. One of the things that I had read in one of the reports, and then I talked to the aunt about, that confused me, that I was looking at a byproduct of this hypoxia. And one of the things that Mr. Rogers did as a little tiny boy is the family he'd get upset or frustrated over things that happen, and he'd pass out, which is unusual. That's very hard to do that. So
Hard to hold your breath
it's
long enough to pass out.
exactly right. You hear about it, but it's actually quite rare for people to be able, or little kids to be able to hold their breath. But this was something that he got so anxious and so upset he would pass out. And one of the aunts told me that actually the family would kind of laugh at it, and I think actually the brother said that it was something that they thought it was funny. You know, they'd get him all riled up and he'd pass out, and it was. But that's not normal. That's something that would be a brain injury, and you'd have to have a neurologist speak to more depth on that. But from a human behavior perspective, that was a flag for me to say there's something going on here that if I were queen of the world would have been looked at. But it was a small town, and nothing was. I don't think there was an understanding that this wasn't an okay thing.
Okay, and you said he was a little tiny, was he school age yet, or,
The
toddler?
aunt said, I asked her how old she saw him do that. She said she saw him do it several times when he was about 5 or 6.
Is that sort of can that be used as like a coping mechanism?
Yeah, the brain has a way, and this is Mr. Rogers Jr. said that he doesn't remember things. We don't participate in things that are too upsetting that we can't handle. That's the trauma part of this. We just don't participate. We'll check out. So it's not unusual to talk to people who have had bad experiences, whether it's military combat, and they can't give you all the details of it, or they'll have a piece missing, and that's just the way of the brain and protecting of itself. When you have somebody who's already had some brain damage, then that would be you're a little tiny kid, and people who are supposed to be taking care of you are frustrating you, and you just basically check out. And so
Okay, so as you continue, as you're talking to people, reviewing these records, did you discover that he had any developmental difficulties or learning difficulties?
According to the PSI and the aunt, he had trouble in school. He had trouble, he would have sobbing attacks in school. He'd get so frustrated that he'd just shout and start crying. And so his paternal grandparents paid for a special school at a Christian school for first grade. Kindergarten, he didn't do so well, but first grade, which would have been the same time that the aunt witnessed this, they put him in a small school where he'd get better attention because he wasn't doing very well and getting picked on and being laughed at. You know, he'd have these sobbing attacks and couldn't get himself under control. So.
Going back to the social service records, how was social services involved with the family?
I read two reports. One was at the age of 9, and that was an investigation for neglect because he had said at school that he hadn't had anything to eat. And so, and you heard the brother say that the mom just wasn't able to parent. And so he didn't have, he allegedly, according to the teachers, he didn't have food and had not eaten since he was at school the day before and would eat like 3 peanut butter sandwiches. And this was at age 9. During that time, there was also discussion in the social service report of him watching porn with dad, but there was no action taken on the part of the Department of Family, DFS, Department of Family Services in Missouri. And then there was a second report at the age of 13 with potential physical abuse, but it also was closed. There was no action taken.
You're aware that his mother committed suicide. Would that have had an effect on Mr. Rogers?
Well, all of these
Or
things
how did it
would,
have an effect,
yeah.
obviously?
I think there are a couple things from my perspective that I was looking at. As his brother stated, after his birth, his schizophrenia can emerge at any point in life, but it usually occurs in late teens into early adulthood is when it emerged. And after the cesarean section, after she gave birth to this medically challenged child, she developed her first symptoms of schizophrenia happened. Not causal. I think that's where the confusion comes in. That wouldn't cause it, but oftentimes a crisis leaving home, something will trigger the symptom. They would have happened anyway, but the father...
Had there been an event, something that...
In any life event, that's true with bipolar disorder as well. These chronic mental illnesses will emerge, and often there's some sort of a crisis point. Sometimes there's no crisis point, and they just develop slowly over time. But sometimes it's a pretty stark. The brother said a psychotic break. There's something that triggers, and so here's a medical event that occurred, an emergency cesarean section with a special needs child, and her symptoms emerged. Apparently, the father saw those two as connected and blamed Jimmy for the mother's mental illness. And according to both the brother and both aunts, throughout his lifetime, said you're the reason your mother's the way she is, from all through. So that, and not in a nice way, in an angry way. And then she commits suicide in March of 2000 with the shotgun, so it's a violent death. And the father blamed Jimmy for her suicide, and the rest of, until he died, would say things, according to the aunts, it's like, why don't you kill yourself like your mother killed herself? This, in fact, the aunt said that she heard him say, they had to cut your mom open to take you out, and now look what happened, this is all your fault. So from birth, basically, until the father died, this is what he heard, is that he was the cause of his mother's not only mental illness, but her ultimate death. And he was 9 at the time that his mother committed suicide.
Okay. going, can you explain for us what it is that happens to the brain, the chemicals in the brain as a result of the hypoxia, and how that translates even into later life?
Objection, foundation lacking.
So the stress response, and what the medical world calls the stress response in the brain, is really the fear response in the brain. It's the old part of our brain that's always looking to see whether we're under threat. And we all have it. Everybody has a stress response in the brain. And so we're meant to trigger that when there's actual threat present. That's what it's for. So a mastodon is chasing us and we either run or we fight the mastodon. That's what it's for. In childhood, when that is triggered over and over and over again, the byproduct of that is elevated cortisol levels. Now, we have known for decades that elevated cortisol levels cause physical problems. And the CDC study, the ACEs study, which you've probably heard of, is a longitudinal study that talks about the impact of elevated cortisol levels from childhood all the way through adulthood, and its impact on things like heart disease, kidney disease, high blood pressure, mental illness, substance use. So we have that good longitudinal study as kind of our base mark, and it's the only of its kind in the world, which is important because it was a large study and a longitudinal, it's a rare thing to get because they're expensive. But we have the ACEs study. So in the developing brain, what elevated cortisol levels do is also impact the hippocampus, and that's the most important part for emotion regulation and being able to understand context. When we have this state of anxiety or fear constantly, we know now with neuroimaging, and we could do it with any of us, I could take you and hook you up to a monitor and I could watch and introduce horrible images to you that upset you, and we could see the old part of your brain light up and become very active, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that reasons through, go dark. Conversely, I could introduce then calming techniques, deep breathing techniques, and we could see the reverse happen. The old part of the brain goes dark and the reasoning, thinking through part of the brain lights up. With a child that's always exposed to fear all their life, and from what I understand, this father was quite a presence, quite a strong personality, very loud voice, very frightening voice, and a big yeller. This fear response would be triggered all the time. Animals have it as well. Humans also add then meaning to it. So we talk to ourselves about that trauma. Who are we? What our worth is. If you take that and also have unstable environments, which is predictability equals safety, we all need to know what to expect, where we're going to live next, who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. When you have all of these situations, grandparents die, they're moved with grandparents. There's a situation where I think dad married again and then divorced immediately, and so there's all these adverse experience of unpredictability that creates anxiety, a huge state of anxiety. So when I got to the point where I saw he was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, that I wasn't the least bit surprised, because that's what I would expect to see happen, because it's just a continuum of the same issues. Problem solving, you've got some brain damage at birth, and the ability then to problem solve, take charge, make plans, think things through, are impacted by that. That's the function of the hippocampus, the mediator between the two, and the hippocampus is the most damaged by elevated cortisol levels.
So, would you agree that it's an explanation, but we're not an excuse?
Exactly. So my role is not to excuse or not excuse. My role is just to understand what happens to people and how they get from point A to point B. And I'm not a legal person, so that's not really my role. My role is just to understand how things occur, putting all the pieces together that would explain where someone got to where they are.
How life events help form
Correct.
the adult.
Because again, I'm a trauma specialist, so ultimately I would want to help someone overcome those adverse experiences, because we're able to create new neural nets throughout our lifespan. which is good because the old adage of you can't teach an old dog new tricks isn't true, but we thought it was. But we know now we can create new neural nets throughout our lifespan and rewire the brain. Our brain gets hardwired by patterning over and over and over again. So we have to actually change the pattern. And that's what the military can do because it's a very patterning thing. We're patterning creatures. And so we look at patterns and patterns of behavior. We can all step out of that pattern, but most of the time we tend to follow that pattern over and over and over again.
And this was a pattern that Jimmy experienced from the time of his birth?
From the time of his birth until his father died, which he was 17 at the time. So that's 17 years of development. And then his brother comes in to be his caregiver. And they think the two muddled together as well as they could, yeah.
Okay. Okay. In your opinion, based on what, well, let me back up a little bit. You mentioned that Jimmy's been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Anything else that you're aware of?
What I saw is that he was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder at the age of 17. He was put on Buspar, which is anxiolytic, and that helps with anxiety. And then also he was put on Lexapro, which is an antidepressant, which we now know also helps the same neurotransmitters. Even though it's an antidepressant, it also helps with anxiety. But wasn't consistent in the taking of it, and I don't know the story behind that, whether or not that's something that was his choice or whether or not it was his circumstances choice and accessibility to the medication, I don't know. But both would be a good starting place. I mean, I don't prescribe, so that would be, but as far as understanding the medications, then that wouldn't surprise me that he'd be put on both of those.
Okay. Based on your review of the records and speaking with other people, would it be your opinion that he is?
Objection, leading.
Would it be your opinion that he is a leader of people in any way? A leader?
I didn't get the impression from any of the family members or from his record that he was a leader. I got the impression that he wanted friends, and so he his aunt told me that he was a kind person. Let me look at her words. She talked about the father and the father's behavior, and I think both of the aunts had tried to get the father to get Jimmy some help for just emotional support. And the father got very angry and with one of the sisters cut off communication with her for some period of time for even suggesting it. She said that he had difficulty following complex instructions but could follow basic instructions. But the more wordy you got, the harder it was for him to reason through those, and that he was mostly in his own world. And that, so he created his own world and kind of created his reality.
As a child or as
She's
an adult?
pretty much all the way through. That's really what she said, is that all the way through. I got nothing to show that he was a leader of any kind. There were several police reports where he asked for the police to intervene because he'd been assaulted. But I didn't see anything else that showed that he was a leader.
Okay, all right. Just have a moment. I don't have any further questions, thank you.
Dr. Evans,
Mr. Hunter,
good to see you again.
nice to see you as well.
All right, so I might have missed it. Who did you interview in preparation for your testimony today?
Two of the aunts, and I'll give you their names. Mary Bodine and Shirley Rogers Parks.
Okay, you didn't interview Jimmy Rogers
No, I did not, no.
or a forensic interview of him?
No.
A forensic questionnaire of some kind?
I did not.
You didn't interview any of his prior physicians?
No, I did not.
Didn't interview Jackie Rogers?
The brother?
Yes.
Yes, we did speak.
Well, there's a difference between speaking and interviewing. Did you conduct an interview?
I did not.
The records you obtained, you mentioned a PSI. PSI from, and when you say PSI, you mean pre-sentence investigation?
Yes,
From where?
from wherever Kathleen sent it to me, I don't know.
Kathleen Fitzgeorge?
Yes,
In fact, all the records that you have were provided to you by Ms. Fitzgeorge's office, right?
and the mitigation specialist, yes,
So your opinion is based on the review of those records, correct?
That's correct.
And those records were chosen for you by Mr. Rogers' lawyers, correct?
That's correct.
You didn't independently go out and gather records on your own, did you?
I did not.
You didn't contact any prior medical facilities on your own to request documentation?
I did not.
You didn't contact any prior schools or employment or anywhere else on your own and obtain documents?
I did not.
So the documents you have were spoon-fed to you by the lawyers,
Well,
correct?
I wouldn't use the term
I'll ask a better question, I'll withdraw the question.
spoon-fed.
The documents you have were given to you by Mr. Rogers' lawyers, right?
Yes, but several of them I requested because I needed more information.
You requested them from his lawyers? Or
Correct.
from the source directly?
From his lawyers.
Okay. There was never a medical exam done on Mr. Rogers, correct? In
By,
preparation for today?
not that I'm aware of.
Passing out could be a result of a medical condition, right?
It could.
And in fact, there's really no way to know whether Mr. Rogers has brain damage unless somebody actually looks at his brain, right?
That's correct.
There are scans for that, isn't that correct?
There are.
And that wasn't done in preparation for today, right?
It was not.
So it's safe to say that your assumption that Mr. Rogers has brain damage is based on records provided to you by his lawyers, right?
Well, the records were from the medical facility and then from the,
Well, let me make sure
Yeah.
that you're answering my question. The records were obtained, were given to you by his lawyers, right?
correct.
There was never a forensic exam of Mr. Rogers?
No.
For example, to understand if a person is suffering from trauma, you said earlier that you wrote a protocol for law enforcement to interview trauma victims,
That's
right?
correct, yes.
And that's for the purpose of determining if they have trauma and what the source of the trauma is. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And a similar protocol could also be administered to Mr. Rogers, right?
It could be.
To determine if he has trauma, and if so, maybe find out what the source is, correct?
Correct.
And that wasn't done, was it?
No, that was not asked of me.
The DCF reports, you said there was a report of Mr. Rogers and his dad watching porn. You said there was no action taken, but there was actually an investigation into that, wasn't
There
there?
was, yes.
And it was found unfounded, right?
Correct.
And so there was action taken. It was investigated and unfounded, right?
Yes.
And then also the abuse investigation, you said there was no action taken. But in fact, it was investigated and found to be unfounded, isn't that
That was
correct?
me, yes. So it's my language that,
Safe to say you don't know what effect Mr. Rogers, the death of his mother, had on him, right?
correct.
Certainly you would expect a young child whose mother commits suicide to be adversely affected. That's an expected effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't really know what the effect is without an interview, do you?
No.
You said earlier that trauma can manifest itself in either being very aggressive or being very withdrawn.
Mm-hmm.
It's safe to say Mr. Rogers is not withdrawn, right?
Oh, I wouldn't say that, no.
He had a job, right?
Yeah,
He had a girlfriend or girlfriends, right? Went to work every day, finished high school,
well,
right?
I think we're defining it differently.
Okay.
I was looking for violent interface with law enforcement.
Again, the question was, he's not withdrawn, though, is he?
from my perspective, when a family member says he pretty much lives in his own world, that's someone who's protected himself. So it's probably semantics more than anything else.
Okay. You talked about earlier that Mr. Rogers was, during birth, had his umbilical cord around his neck, right? Again, it's hard to know what the effect was, if any. That's a common occurrence, isn't that correct?
Well, no.
Babies being born breech or
not,
having an
It's not a
umbilical
common
cord?
occurrence, no, and it is an incident. And it is a medical issue. He was hospitalized and rushed for it, so
Well, my question was, that's a common occurrence, isn't it?
I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence. We'd have to look at the statistics. I mean, that's not something that's a normal birth.
And it's hard to
So-
know what the effect is on the baby, again, without a medical exam, right?
Well, on a baby, he had a medical exam. He was rushed to a specialty hospital for it. Or if you're asking what the
Let me
impact
ask
on
you a better
adulthood.
question.
Your Honor, I'd ask that you not interrupt the witness once he asks the question.
Let me ask a better question.
Let the witness finish in the future.
Yes, sir. The question I want to ask is, it's hard to understand what the medical effect would have been on a child from having his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck without some kind of brain scan, right?
I said I didn't have the baby's records. I had the mother's records.
And again, those records were given to you by the lawyers.
Correct.
You're not trained in medicine.
I am not.
You're not trained in neuropsychology, neurophysiology.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Now, I'm a clinical social worker, so I'm trained in the brain, and I'm a translational researcher. So what that means as a translational researcher is you take one discipline, which is my case, neuroscience, and translate it to direct practice. So that's what I'm published in as a translational researcher, because neuroscientists only publish in neuroscience journals. That's not available to general practitioners. So that's what I've been doing for 20 years, training physicians and law enforcement, is translating what's coming out of neuroscience. Even though I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a translational researcher, translating that to direct practice.
You're not trained in diagnosing and treating brain damage, right?
I am trained in diagnosing and treating developmental issues.
I'm talking about brain damage.
I'm trained in diagnosing and treating the resultant, so learning disabilities, anxiety, depression.
You would be unable to determine whether or not a person had brain damage and prescribe a treatment for it, right?
That's true. I would be able to prescribe a treatment.
I think you've answered my
Here,
question.
I haven't answered it. May I continue?
You can finish, ma'am.
I would be able to treat once the diagnosis was given of brain damage, because there are then psychological issues related to that, and I am qualified to do that in my scope of practice.
You're not a psychiatrist.
I am not. That's a medical doctor.
Yeah, you don't hold an MD.
That's a medical doctor now.
Thank you.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm gonna step down.